This is Revolving Door Syndrome, and I'm Dr. Nina Su. Our education system is in a code red emergency. We are failing our students, our parents, and educators, yet are unwilling to have constructive debate on the root cause. Hot topics like the structured literacy versus balanced literacy debate results in sensationalist, biased headlines that deepen the ideological divide. According to New Zealand's Auditor General, the Ministry of Education does not know why we have worsening disparities in educational outcomes for our richest and poorest neighbourhoods. When we send our children to state school to be educated by teachers who are trained in taxpayer-funded tertiary institutions, we should expect that the training received by teachers and the education provided in state schools are following the evidence in the science of learning. But when you speak to parents, educators, and students, something is going terribly wrong. To talk more on where, how, and why we have gotten education wrong, I bring on Dr. Nina Hood, a secondary school teacher who founded the Education Hub, an organisation that creates learning opportunities for teachers that bridges the gap between scientific research and everyday practice. Dr. Nina is also the academic director of the Teachers Institute, a new education program for new teachers that puts the science of learning and in-classroom practical experience at the heart of teacher training. So, Dr. Nina, I'm hearing from a lot of university educators that the kids that are making it to university are really struggling with being able to read the large volumes of reading that they're assigned to and produce writing that's actually coherent and of high quality expected of a tertiary student. But at the same time, we're also hearing that our pass rates of NCA and our university entrance is actually going downhill. So I'm wondering, what does this say about, NCA and our education system? How is it that, children are failing at the secondary school level and the ones that do make it to university are also lagging behind? What does this mean for New Zealand?
That's a really good question with lots of different parts to it. So I think you're absolutely right. There's growing anecdotal evidence coming out of our universities that the students coming into universities aren't necessarily as well prepared as they could be. I mean, and that's not all students, but a good proportion. And it's something that people are picking up across all the different disciplines. And if we look at what's behind that, I think there are probably a range of different factors, but one of them has got to be around how well or not NCEA does prepare our students for academic pathways beyond. And I think there are a number of different aspects that are playing out there. One is around the level of literacy required to pass NCEA. And we do have some data. There was a TEC study that was done several years ago, which
What was the TEC? The
Tertiary Education Commission.
Oh, yes.
Did a study that looked at the literacy levels of students who had passed NCEA. And I can't remember the exact figures, but essentially what it showed was that a good proportion of students who had actually passed level 2 NCEA didn't actually have a particularly high level of literacy. So there's not necessarily a correlation between getting an NCEA and having, the robust literacy skills that you need. I think also just the way that NCEA is structured means that you can cherry pick standards. So you might not necessarily be getting a really broad coverage of particular subject areas. And you can also opt into different standards which might be easier to pass than others.
Well, that's quite concerning. I mean, there's the movement to have these compulsory literacy, like reading, writing, and numeracy exams, I'm told.
Yeah, the co-requisites.
Yeah, so I think my understanding is that the recent, I think this year, of the kids who've sat them, about 50% are passing each of one of those things. That's got to be concerning.
Hugely concerning. Yeah, absolutely. And particularly when you think about they're becoming co-requisites, which means that if those students don't ultimately pass them, they cannot pass NCEA. So we've got a number of concerning things coming out. One is just the fact that a pretty large proportion of our young people haven't developed the literacy and numeracy skills that they need in order to really succeed and thrive in the world. And that's then going to have a flow-on impact on the qualifications that they can receive.
Some people say that the problem is the test. What do you say to that?
I don't think it's just an issue with the test. So there are always going to be questions about how we examine our students, the reliability and validity of them. But I think what we can also say is that we have enough data points now across a range of different measures to know that there are a large number of New Zealand students who don't have the basic literacy and numeracy skills that they need in order to succeed in later life.
So let's say we agree that this is a problem, that the test is true, and that actually we have a crisis in literacy and numeracy in our New Zealand students, and potentially around the world as well. I think we're seeing a lot of that in other Western countries as well. Why? Why is this happening? I think a lot of people want to blame COVID. I'm sure that COVID, or the pandemic and the school lockdowns and all these sorts of things over the last 3 or 4 years has severely affected school attendance and school engagement, and parents are probably pulling their hair out trying to help their kids learn at home. Is it COVID, or is this something that's been happening long before COVID?
So, like anything in education, it's always multifactorial. So there's not just one thing that is leading to these outcomes. So if we look at achievement in reading, writing, maths, we were seeing a decline since 2012. So there was a decline happening pre-COVID.
And that's in our NCA, like level 1, 2, and 3, or is that earlier on?
That is based on international testing data. So PISA for our 15-year-olds, and then PIRLS and TIMS for our primary school aged students. Our other measure, the National Monitoring Study, would say that there may not have been necessarily a decline, but results have stagnated, and they're stagnating at really poor levels. So something was definitely happening pre-COVID. I think what the anecdotal data is telling us coming out of schools is that COVID has had an impact, and it's having a long-term impact on our students. And I think we can see some of the declining rates in NCEA achievement post-COVID can be attributed in part to the drop in learning that occurred as a result of COVID, and a whole range of other factors that are coming out. I think if we then look at, what was happening before COVID that was leading to these declines, there are a range of different things going on. So I think we can look at the curriculum. We can look at pedagogy and how students are actually being taught, particularly for our reading levels. I think we've got to look at the role that technology is playing. And one of the things we know is that fewer teenagers are reading for pleasure these days. And so if you're not getting that reading mileage, that's going to have a flow-on impact into your reading ability. So there are a range of different things happening.
Let's talk about the PISA scores.
Sure.
So is the PISA score something that's, year by year, there's like a mark that we have to meet, or is it that we are just comparing ourselves to other countries and that's how it works?
Yeah. So you can do both things in PISA. So it's every 3 years. Students, 15-year-olds, sit tests in reading, maths and science. They also do a survey that tests sort of more affective characteristics, which is really interesting to look at as well. So
what do you mean by affective?
So
like
their
mood?
motivation, their sense of connection and belonging in school, questions about wellbeing and mental health. So a range of different things are tested there as well. So yes, through PISA, you can compare yourself to other countries. For me, I'm actually not particularly interested in that. I'm more interested in how New Zealand's doing comparative to previous years. And what we see in all three of those areas is that since 2012, there has been a statistically significant decline in student achievement.
That's interesting, because 2012 also happens to be the year that I notice there's significant worsening mental health in young people as well.
Yeah.
And I've talked about this before, and I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this podcast probably heard about Jonathan Haidt as well, who's this researcher from the US on social psychology. And he has shown that there's a lot of research to show that social media and the use of smartphone devices has significantly impacted young people's mental health. And also, I think by virtue of their affecting their mental health, also their education as well. So it's quite interesting you bring up 2012 as a specific year, because that's what I noticed as well. Since then, for young people in New Zealand, there's essentially been a doubling of diagnoses of anxiety and depression for both girls and boys, probably about every 3 years. That's what I've noticed, which is pretty shocking to go from about 10% to sort of like 25, 30, 40% almost.
And schools are definitely noticing that. And we're getting reports through around the impact of mental health and poorer wellbeing of students and how that's impacting teachers and how teachers are engaging with students. But we also know there's a really close connection between mental health and wellbeing and your ability to succeed academically as well. They're really closely connected.
What's the evidence on it?
On that connection. So we know that your ability to learn, your ability to engage in learning is impacted by your emotions. So that could be, short-term things. So, you have a bad day, you have a fight with your parents before you go to school, you're not going to learn as well at school that day. And, if you have an exam that day, that's going to have an impact on your exam. But we also know that if you've got longer term mental health issues, wellbeing issues, that is also going to have an impact on your ability to engage in your learning. It impacts your cognitive function. So that then is going to have a flow-on impact into your ability to learn to achieve the academic results that you might want to.
I think I was reading in the news the other day that there's increasing amount of school absences specifically for the reason of mental health. What do you think about that? Is that going to make mental health worse? Is it, should we get kids back in the classroom? How do we fix that problem?
Oh, it's so complex. And do we want kids back in the classroom? Absolutely we do. I mean, we know that students who attend more school ultimately do better at school. They get more learning time. But there's also a really positive social interaction that's going on as well, which is really important. But again, when we're thinking about absenteeism, again, it's not just one thing that's driving it. There are a whole range of things going on. And I think one of the things we need to really look at are our schools as well. So, we put a lot of attention on students and families and what's going on there. And those are important things to look at and important things to address. But we also need to look at, why is it that children aren't valuing schools? Why is it that they don't actually want to attend? And we need to think about that and potentially look at how we can reform aspects of schools to make them places that students actually want to attend and see value in.
Let's talk about the New Zealand curriculum. My understanding is that I think maybe the 2000s or the 2010s, we started moving from a sort of knowledge-rich to an inquiry-based sort of curriculum. Is that right? Am I right?
Yeah, you are. So in 2007, we got a new curriculum. It was compulsory to implement it from 2010. And what we saw in that new curriculum was, you're right, it was essentially a removal of most content from the curriculum. Which I know it sounds absolutely bonkers. And when I try to explain it to people who haven't seen it, they sort of look at me like, what are you talking about? How can you remove content from the curriculum? And I mean, that is essentially what we did. So we have 8 learning areas in New Zealand schools. So your English, your science, your maths, your social sciences, your arts, health and PE, technology, languages. And we're broken into phases, so across the different year groups. And what we're seeing is, whereas in previous versions of the curriculum, there was a reasonable amount of detail about what it is you were meant to be teaching students in each of those subjects or learning areas. In 2007, most of that got removed. So if we look at, say, the social studies curriculum, it would say comments like, you need to teach your students about migration. Great topic, really important topic, very relevant to New Zealand, but it didn't provide any more detail than that. It didn't say what about migration, particular case studies, how long you should be spending on it. And so what we've seen as a result of that is that across different schools, and sometimes even within the same schools, there's huge variability in terms of what students are learning and critically how much they're learning as well. And so you've got a really big divide in terms of the knowledge bases that young people are developing through their schooling.
And I guess the other concern is the sequencing of education, is my understanding as well. If you learn one part this year and then the next year you're going to have probably a different teacher, even within the same subject, and they'll teach you something different. But what if that different thing depends on you learning something else that you didn't learn because you had a different teacher and it wasn't coordinated up in a sequence?
You're absolutely right. So I actually did some research last year that was looking at how schools were approaching that within the curriculum. And what it showed was that, yeah, you're not getting that nice sequencing, necessarily that sequencing of knowledge from year to year. And you often had situations where students were learning the same topic in multiple years and actually not expanding on their knowledge. And we know that particularly in some subjects, that sequence and that sort of accumulation of knowledge is really critically important. And if you don't get, the one bit first, it makes it really hard to go on and learn and engage in future learning, deeper learning in that particular subject. And so that is absolutely an issue, and it's an issue that's still playing out in schools.
Guess one argument is that schools want to have autonomy in how they teach and what they teach, versus the idea that all children should have a standardized education no matter which school they go to. And I guess the question is, well, what if you have schools that are very well resourced in high socioeconomic areas where, they get a lot of money through donations from the local community, and then you've got other schools that don't have that same access to resources? What does it say about the access to education for different schools? Well, access to quality of curriculum for different schools?
Yeah. So there's a lot in that question to unpack. But I think if we're really focusing on equity, I'm always going to be a proponent of a pluralistic education system. I don't believe that there's just one type of schooling that's going to suit every child. However, within that, I do believe that there are minimum standards that we should require every single student in our New Zealand schools to be reaching, and we need to be supporting them to get there. And part of that is around having a broad base of knowledge that they can then take on so that they can understand and engage with the world and all the different aspects of the world. And what we know from the research is that what you know and how much you know directly impacts what you can go on to learn. So essentially, the more you know, the more interconnected it is, the easier it is for you to keep learning more. So essentially, you've got a situation of the rich get richer. It's a classic Matthew effect going on. And so one of the things that a more standardized curriculum can do is ensure that all children are receiving access to that fundamental knowledge that we believe they should all have access to. In saying that, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily standardizing everything. It doesn't mean that you're telling schools you can't also, have aspects of your own curriculum that you think are important and that you want to develop. It's just saying that these are the non-negotiables. Every student must learn them.
If that's knowledge-rich curriculum, what is an inquiry-based curriculum? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I would say that it's not an inquiry-based curriculum, it's an inquiry-based pedagogy.
Right.
So I think what we've had in the 2007 curriculum is sort of a competency and skills-based curriculum. So rather than specifying the knowledge, we're specifying the competencies that we want young people to develop. When we talk about inquiry learning, we're really looking at a pedagogical approach. And it has been a very dominant pedagogical approach across many New Zealand schools over the last couple of decades. And what it's really about is, rather than what we might call explicit teaching, where the teacher is directing it, the teacher is identifying the knowledge and the skills that are to be learned, they're sequencing and structuring them, they're explaining them, getting students to practice them, first in a sort of scaffolded environment and then independently. With inquiry, it's more open. And so there's less reliance on teacher explanation and more on students asking questions and discovering information and ideas more independently.
Okay. That sounds like a good thing.
It is.
For children to be curious about things.
We absolutely want children to be curious. And I think often in education circles, we sort of position explicit instruction sort of in opposition to inquiry learning. My view is that they both have a really important place, and we want to be fostering both of them. Of course, we want children to be thinking deeply and inquiring into different topics. However, what the evidence really clearly tells us is that you cannot inquire effectively on a topic that you don't know anything about. And that when children are just starting to learn about a particular topic, the most effective way to support them in that learning is to guide them in it. And then once they've developed that sort of base fundamental knowledge, we can then get them to engage in those higher order thinking skills. So rather than, starting off with, okay, let's get children to think critically about this topic, they need to know something about that topic first, right? So for me, for example, if you told me to think critically or solve a problem in physics, I'd be like, I can't do that because my knowledge of physics is not that great. So I need to actually learn that information and then I can do that. If you said, we need you to think critically on a topic in history, I'd be like, yeah, probably can do a lot of that because I have far more of a knowledge base in there in which to think critically on.
I think it's interesting because a lot of people who are concerned about education say, we just need to teach young people how to think critically. But you can't, like you said, you can't really think critically about a topic unless you have the base fundamentals to actually then think, well, what is wrong or what is right about this, to then move on to the next step.
Absolutely. So then when we're thinking about the curriculum in our education system, we want to think about that continuum, right? How do we make sure that we build that foundational knowledge so that ultimately our young people can engage in those higher order thinking skills? Because of course we want them to think critically and creatively and to solve problems. But they need that knowledge base to be able to get there.
I think what I'm worried about at a societal level is, there is a movement to say, about children's rights and, young people's rights and that they should have a say. And absolutely they should have a say. But I think sometimes in certain cases we're forgetting about, I guess, who's the adult in the room. And that's what I'm hearing from teachers as well. They find it difficult to control the classroom. And, there's that, you need to get down on their level. And this is in parenting as well and all that. And I see it a little bit in the emergency room, where you can just see that the parents have sort of lost control, I guess, because people are like, got to get down on their level, reduce that hierarchy. But at the same time, there needs to be an adult in the room. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do know what you're saying, and I know what you're saying from both an educational perspective and a parenting perspective. And I think, again, sometimes it can be a sort of misunderstanding of what we're talking about there, because of course we want to give children a voice. Of course we want to be, acknowledging them and connecting with them. But at the same time, like you say, children don't necessarily know what it is that they need to learn or what they need to know for future life, right?
They need to trust that there's a teacher that's going to tell them and guide them. And
Absolutely. And, the other thing, and this comes from the research, is learning's hard, right? It's, it can be enjoyable and pleasurable, but actually when you're learning something new, it can be really challenging. And as humans, we will do everything we can to not have to think hard. So, there is just inbuilt in all students this, why would I learn this? It's really hard to do, unless you've got a teacher coming along and saying, actually, there's value in it, but I'm going to support you with it as well.
Let's talk about literacy pedagogy. I think this has sort of been more in the media this year, especially because we have a government who said, some schools did balanced literacy, primary schools did balanced literacy, some schools did structured literacy, they'd left it up to the schools to decide. And this government has said, we're not doing that. We're going to roll out structured literacy for all schools. Mm-hmm. Some people are up in arms, stop telling schools what to do, blah, blah, blah. And some people are very much welcoming this because they have had their own children, say, suffering under balanced literacy, not actually them saying that their kids haven't learned how to read through this. Could you tell me sort of what's the evidence behind both pedagogies, and also actually what is a pedagogy? It's a word that gets used a lot, and I think most people probably don't quite understand what it means.
Yeah, absolutely. I had to learn what it meant when I went to Teachers College. Teaching pedagogy is just essentially the how of teaching. So the particular practices that teachers employ in order to teach a particular piece of content. And then to come to the other part of your question around what is structured literacy, what are we talking about here, and what does the evidence say? The evidence is pretty clear on the importance of what we could call structured approaches to teaching children how to read. And essentially what that means is that it's around having an explicit, structured approach to the teaching of reading and writing, with a particular emphasis on those initial stages of learning to read and write. So it's around teaching children how to decode words. So if you have the word cat, rather than showing them the whole word and teaching them that word is cat.
And a picture of a cat.
Or a picture of a cat. It's saying, okay, we know that the C makes a k sound, the A an a, and the T a t. So let's blend those all together, k, a, t, cat. So you're teaching them phonological awareness, the ability to be able to decode words, and then ultimately the different, essentially, spelling rules that we have, and the English language is full of different spelling rules that children have to learn in order to be able to effectively read and write. And then, you know, in terms of writing, it's about learning how to do the opposite of decoding. So you're encoding. So, you know, you want to write a story about a cat. So you have to think, okay, cat, C-A-T, to be able to write, but also then explicitly teaching the ability to handwrite. So how do we actually form our letters? How do we hold our pencil? And then slowly building it up. So we then learn about syntax and how we put sentences together, and then ultimately how we put whole paragraphs together. I think where we sometimes see sort of antagonism within the literacy space is that there would be people that say, well, yes, but that's not enough in order to be able to teach someone to read. And they're absolutely right. That isn't enough to teach someone to read. We also need to make sure that we're building children's understanding and meaning. We want to make sure that they're in really rich literacy environments. So they're having the opportunity to be read really rich and engaging stories, to be exposed to a wide range of vocabulary. So it's not just let's just sit down and drill children in this, but it's how do we make sure that we have all the different components of a really rich literacy classroom in order to make sure that all our young people develop those fundamental skills.
I feel like there's this really well-intentioned movement of like, oh, you know, if we just make children do really boring stuff, they're not going to engage, and we're basically punishing children by making them doing stuff like learning how to read through the phonics way of learning how to read, and, you know, making children do things like, I don't know, learning times tables, which I think is actually quite useful. You know, all of these basic things are quite essential. But, you know, there's a movement of, oh, we just want children to be curious about things. And if they're curious enough, they will learn for themselves. And from what I understand about balanced literacy, or the whole language approach really as part of the balanced literacy, is, oh, if we just, you know, put in nice pictures and, you know, make sure that children, you know, have nice stories to read. This is my understanding of balanced literacy. I don't know if or whole language approach. Like, why did we end up with these two sort of different approaches? And yeah, could you tell me the evidence behind balanced literacy, or the reading recovery approach that we have in New Zealand, or have had?
Sure. So, I mean, what you're referring to has been called the reading wars, right? And it's not something that's just unique to New Zealand. It's played out around the world.
But I think something to mention about is the founder of reading recovery.
The founder of reading recovery was from New Zealand, so Mari Clay, and she developed reading recovery, which is a program, and it was a program that was prevalent in New Zealand until very recently, which was essentially a remedial program for children who were struggling to learn to read in your whole classroom setting and were pulled out for individual tutoring. And it was based on research that Mari Clay did, I think, during the 1970s. And it was basically, a lot of it was based on the whole language approach, on what's called the 3 Qing approach. And so some of what it involved was getting students, when they were learning to read, to not necessarily start with the words on the page, but to start with meaning making from other clues that they had. So from illustrations in a book, and and then just looking at the first letter of a word and then thinking about what word would make sense in that context. And the issue with that is that particularly for children, the children who are struggling to learn to read because they're struggling with their phonological awareness, their ability to decode, it actually wasn't equipping them with the skills that they needed in order to learn to read. So they weren't actually learning how to decode a word into its parts in order to be able to read it. They were learning to just ultimately recognize whole words. And what we saw from a lot of the research coming out about reading recovery was that, in the first couple of years of school, actually children could essentially fudge their way through. But once they got to around about year 3, year 4, where texts were becoming more challenging, because they'd never learned how to decode words, they actually could never progress in their reading. And so they stagnated.
Because once you've come across a more complicated word, it becomes very hard to decode.
Exactly. You don't have the strategy. You can't decode it. You don't have that knowledge to be able to do it. And all of us, when we're reading, we are actually decoding words. We just don't know that because it's become so automated because we've done it so often that we're not actually consciously aware that that's what we're doing.
How much of this is having an effect? Because like we say, up until recently, schools could choose whether they wanted to incorporate some whole language approach versus structured literacy. How much of that do you think is having an impact on our literacy outcomes for young people today?
Oh, I think it's absolutely playing a role, but I do not think it's the whole story. I think all the evidence tells us that ensuring that children get those fundamental building blocks in learning how to read and write essential. And if they don't have them, it is going to affect their literacy abilities throughout their lives unless we come back and address it. So is it having an impact? Absolutely. But I don't think it's the only thing that's having an impact. So if we come back to the conversation we were having about the curriculum, I think the fact that a lot of New Zealand children don't have a particularly broad knowledge base is also impacting their ability to read. Because what we know is that actually our ability to read or to comprehend is based on our ability to decode words, but also our ability to understand them. So even if you can decode the word cat, if you don't know what a cat is, it's meaningless, right? You're not actually reading it. And so what we know from the research on learning to read and our reading comprehension is that our background knowledge on a topic really impacts our ability to interpret what we're reading. And there's a very famous study come out of the US, which is called colloquially known as the baseball study. And what happened is that children were given a piece of text about baseball, and they were then given a set of reading comprehension questions on it and marked. And the researchers divided the children into two groups, essentially strong reading comprehension, students with strong reading comprehension skills and students with weaker reading comprehension skills. And what they found when they analysed that data on the baseball text was that actually the impact of those two groups was much less than when they divided the children between those who knew a lot about baseball and those that didn't. And that's because even the weaker readers, because they had that background knowledge about how baseball works, were better able to answer those questions than some of the stronger readers who perhaps didn't know that much about baseball.
So moving on to my next thing I kind of want to talk about, which is really what is the role of evidence and research in education, right? So we've talked about the structured literacy and the whole language approach. And I guess what I want to understand is, where is the science in education? How do we end up with these sort of, I guess, two schools of thought? Because I believe that on these, like you said, the reading wars, there are people who believe strongly in one or the other. So where is the science in the science of learning, and how can we end up in this place where we don't agree on some pretty fundamental things about reading?
Such a good question. So the role of evidence in education is such an interesting topic, and it's so contested, and lots of different conversations about actually what counts as evidence in education, what are we looking at? And actually, if we look at reading and literacy, for me, that's one of the less complicated areas in terms of sort of looking at the evidence in education, because we have a really easy way of measuring outcomes. So
But I guess that even though you say that there's a very easy way to measure outcomes,
it was still contested.
it's still contested.
Yeah.
And I wonder where this comes from, because I think that
think
there are people who've got really good intentions about balanced
Absolutely.
literacy and whole language approach. But what I wonder about is, just because you have good intentions doesn't mean that what you're promoting is essentially effective. Because what I understand from Mari Clay is that this all came from very good intentions of, I'm going to go to these poor schools and help these children who can't read. And at the beginning, it's like you say, for the first couple of years, maybe there's some good outcomes for these children. But then if you follow them up long term, maybe not so much.
Yeah.
Right. And so I want to understand, how is it that something you say is quite simple, like structured literacy versus, whole language approach, where there is evidence, even then, in academic circles, there's difference of opinion.
So I think probably a range of different things. I think some of it is just ideological and philosophical.
How do we get there?
Because I think part of what education and learning is incredibly emotive, right? And there hasn't historically been a particularly strong use of particularly quantitative evidence within education. So we don't have quite the same tradition in education that we have in other subjects. If you look at specifically at the reading recovery example, well, what proponents of reading recovery would say is that, well, our data suggests that a good proportion of children at the end of their 16 weeks in reading recovery have actually made progress. And that's true. Against their measures, they have made progress. Where that gets let down is that long term, that's not sustained. And I believe even Mari Clay would say, well, yes, but we can't control for what happens afterwards. So it's to do with the teachers that they have, in year 2, 3, and 4, which is going to make more difference than what reading recovery does. I mean, so that would be how they would justify that side of things.
I guess, for parents who are listening, or people who are teachers, we send our kids to school. We trust that the teachers, the schools, the Ministry of Education knows what they're doing. But it seems like there are a lot of parents and teachers who are very concerned about I'm concerned about what's happening. So how do we move forward? How do we make sure that actually we have an education system that is evidence-based?
Yeah, great question. So I think we are making progress, right? So if we even just look at the literacy example, we have more and more primary schools that are implementing structured approaches to literacy. And they did that before the government mandate as well, because they actually trialed these. They realized what they were doing wasn't working. They knew they needed to do something different. So they went to the evidence. They saw that, hey, maybe this would be the right approach. They tried it. They had really great results, and so they've continued doing it. So I think we do have examples of change actually being driven by teachers and schools, which is incredibly exciting. We now slowly have a Ministry of Education that is catching up in terms of how to approach the teaching of literacy. I think across other areas, it's a process, and it's not necessarily an easy one. But I think we are slowly making progress in terms of trying to bring more evidence to bear in terms of how we structure our curriculum, how we think about pedagogy in the classroom, how we sustain that long term. That's a really great question.
What do you think about modern learning environments? Please explain.
Yeah, great. So modern learning environments. So these came out in sort of the late 2000s. And essentially they are open plan environments where you have multiple classes within a single space. Look, personally, I am not a great fan of them. I think some schools have done a better job of using modern learning environments than others. But I think by and large, the evidence would suggest that there are some really problematic aspects of them.
What was the evidence to suggest that it should be done? Did the Ministry of Education put them forward without evidence, or was there evidence to actually say that there were some positive outcomes for something like this?
No, not a lot of evidence
Not
went
a lot
into
of
that.
evidence.
So actually there's been some really interesting research out of Victoria University that sort of tried to track the policy decision-making process that sat behind modern learning environments. And yeah, there's really very, very little evidence. And if you wanted to be cynical, you would say it was all about cost, because it's a lot cheaper to build open plan classrooms than it is to build your sort of traditional single cell classrooms.
Because I guess that's the concern, right? Is that, if you can roll out these things called model learning environments, which potentially, I don't know if the evidence suggests this, but whether it does suggest that it caused negative outcomes for some children. I mean, I honestly, I personally can't imagine being one of 90 kids in a modern learning environment with 3 teachers. I just think it would be mental. I think, we talk about kids with neurodiversity. I honestly think that a lot of these children, whether they're neurodiverse or not, would have done much worse in a modern learning environment than they would have in a standard 30 student class. Whether or not these children would have actually still been, diagnosed with neurodiversity, that's a separate question. But I think that they would do a lot worse in a modern learning environment.
Yeah. So look, we do have some evidence coming out to say that, particularly for neurodivergent children, being in a modern learning environment can be incredibly problematic for them. Increases issues around regulation. But I think also it depends on how they're being used, right? And there's not just one way that modern learning environments are being used. So there are a whole lot of different dimensions that are coming into it. And I think what we often had was that it's not, a modern learning environment is not simply about the actual physical space, although that's part of it, but it's also about the pedagogies that are sitting alongside it. And it often sits with a huge amount of student-directed, inquiry-based learning, which, as we've talked about, has some limitations.
So, Nina, you are a doctor. You've got a PhD in education, I believe. So I'm sure you're, swimming in the waters of people who are in academia, right? Presumably, people in academia have influence in the Ministry of Education and the universities. You would hope, academics are teaching academics and academics are doing the research, right? So if there are all these academics around, how did we end up in the situation where we said, okay, we'll do modern learning environments, okay, we'll do reading recovery, okay, we'll have an inquiry-based pedagogy instead of a knowledge-rich curriculum. These sort of things seem to have occurred around a similar time period. So what do you think? How do you think we ended up in this situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, your question about the degree to which academics have influence on the ministry, I don't know that I could actually speak to that, and I don't know that they always do, or it might be that some do and some don't. I think.
Well, I guess there's disagreement amongst academics.
There is disagreement, and I mean,
which is probably a fine.
It's
want
great.
academics.
We want disagreement. I mean, we don't. Absolutely, that's one of the beauties of academia, is that we should have the ability to challenge different ideas, to present evidence, to discuss that. I think one thing to note is that New Zealand is not alone in how we approached education, particularly in that sort of period of the 2000s. We were following trends that were going on around the world. So we're not necessarily, it wasn't just us. And I think that there was a dominant ideology that developed around that time around what education should be and how to structure it.
Can you explain a little bit more about this ideology?
Yeah.
Is there a name for it?
So I think, there are various names for it. So one of the things is sort of the 21st century skills movement as part of this, which incorporated the shift from a focus on knowledge to a focus on skills and competencies, the movement towards inquiry-based learning. So, yeah, it was something that, and it's an ideology that did get picked up in many of the universities and some of the other bodies involved in educational research in New Zealand and internationally. And that did then have a substantial impact on teachers and schools and how things developed.
I guess what I'm concerned, I listened to this podcast called Sold a Story, and it was specifically about how,
great, right?
Really great podcast, talking about how this whole language approach got,
wild. Did you
it
just
went
think some
wild.
of it was absolutely wild
Very
listening to it?
wild. The way that it explained whole language approach of, basically telling children that they should guess. Yep. They should guess the word. And I couldn't believe that this is what children were being taught. And what I heard out of the podcast is, I think it's 8 episodes. One of them was talking about how, student teachers going through the system, depending on whichever university they were going to, were not allowed to question whether these methods were effective. And if you were questioning it, just not even disagreeing, but just simply questioning it, you were sort of hung out to dry as a non-believer or a heretic, essentially. What do you think that kind of attitude has? What do you think that kind of attitude, how that impacts our quality of education and our quality of discussion about education is?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's something I've thought a lot about over the last few years, and that is how we engage in critical dialogue about key issues in education. And I do not always believe that spirit of critical engagement is encouraged in our institutions, including in our universities. And, I know what people have thought about some of the things that I've said about education. And I've been told that I shouldn't say things or I'm not allowed to say things. And I think it's incredibly worrying. And it's not because I think that everyone should have the same point of view. I really don't. But unless we can actually start having a proper discussion about the issues and have a discussion about the issues and not make it personal, then we've not got any hope.
And not make it ideological.
And not make it ideological. We've not got a lot of hope of moving forward. And so I think it is incredibly problematic. And that should be, that ability to engage in those discussions should be, the very bedrock of our universities and our academic system. And I don't think that's necessarily always the case at the moment.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about disagreement amongst academics, right? So one of the new things you're doing, so you were the founder of the Education Hub, and now you've moved on to some newer ventures with the Teachers Institute. My understanding is that Teachers Institute is about giving people who want to be a teacher more of a sort of in-classroom, hands-on education, as alongside some more of the theoretical science and cognitive science of learning and all that, right? Some people, some critics, say that a shift to in-classroom teaching devalues university-based teacher education. They say that teaching is a profession, not a trade. So why the move back to on-the-job training for teachers?
Yeah, so great question. And I mean, I would actually slightly shift some of the things that have been said. So yeah, in terms of the Teachers Institute, it was set up by a group of schools because they weren't satisfied with how teachers currently are being trained, and wanted to make sure that when teachers came out of their teacher training, that they had the full range of knowledge and skills that they needed in order to be successful in the classroom. So the way that it's set up is that all of our trainees have what's called a home school. So that's the school that they will spend the vast majority of the year in. They will be part of that school community, but they never have sole charge of a class. So they're paired with a mentor teacher, and they work with that mentor teacher in those classes for the whole year to develop their teaching skills. But importantly, they also come out of school 1 to 2 days a week, and they come to the Teachers Institute where they get what you could call the theoretical component of the program as well. So that's where they get to engage with the research. They get to build their knowledge of how students learn, of what effective pedagogies are. They get to unpack some of what they're doing in the school classroom, and then get to try out things in the constrained setting of a workshop before they then go out into schools and practice them in classrooms with real children. So
that sounds very sensible. So why the criticism?
Well, I think in some ways it's because in education we don't often like doing things that are new or different. So I think that's part of it. And I also think, we've had over the last 20 years a move towards the majority of teacher training being based in universities. And so, it is different. It's a new way of doing things. I would hope that what we're developing is as rigorous, if not more rigorous, than what's happening in universities. And we're really trying to create a close connection between what we're doing as part of their sort of theoretical component of the course and what they're experiencing in their schools, and making sure that they are developing the skills that they actually need to be successful in the classroom.
What are those skills? What are those skills that you think that the Teachers Institute are going to provide that the universities might not be?
Excellent question. So I think, there are a whole range of things, but, one is we are doing a lot on the science of learning, making sure that teachers understand how people learn.
Shouldn't the universities been doing that? Because they're university
thought,
level.
But I remember when I did my master's, so I'd done my teacher training, I'd already been teaching in secondary schools, and then I did my master's, and suddenly I was encountering all this research on how people learn. And I just remember thinking so clearly, I wish I'd known this when I was a teacher. So no, historically we haven't had a lot of that.
So what did you learn then when you were in university?
I did a lot of lesson planning, which, valuable, need to learn how to plan a lesson, but not necessarily all the things that sort of underpin that. So we want to teach the trainees around sort of the different steps and stages of effective pedagogy, and really breaking it down into those practical skills that they need to do. So how do you explain a new concept? How do you support your students to practice that? How do you engage in really robust and rigorous questioning in the classroom? And then, there's the curriculum side of things. How do you conceptualize your subject? How do you break your subject up so that you can teach it in units, in lessons? How do you conduct really great assessment in the classroom? How do you build a classroom environment that is inclusive, that fosters a sense of belonging, that builds students' motivation? So trying to think about the different components that we know go into effective teaching and breaking them down so that the trainees get to experience what it is, why they need to do it, and then the practicing of how they actually do it.
And that's what sounds great, but isn't that what's happening in universities now in terms of education?
I'm not sure that that's universally happening across all universities.
What is the evidence
of what's happening?
Yeah,
so there were a couple of reports released last year on initial teacher education. And I think what they found was a really strong disconnect between the reality of schools and what trainees were being taught. There was definitely evidence coming out to suggest that in most programs, trainees were getting no exposure to what we might call the science of learning.
It just makes you question, what is the point, right? Because to go to university, you usually would be, going to university would usually be about a higher level thinking and reasoning and understanding the science of whatever.
They are getting that. I think one of the things that we see in some university programs is that they are quite traditional university programs, right? So the way that the students are assessed is, write an essay on this topic.
Listen to someone talk, read these readings and write a
fine,
essay.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that they can practically apply what they've written about in the classroom setting as well. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is to think about, well, how can we create assessments for our trainees that are based on actual tasks that they're doing in the classroom? So you don't get a huge amount of, they don't have to do their teaching in the classroom and then do something completely separate for their assessments, but we create that connection between them.
I've seen quite a lot of surveys come out this year talking about new teachers feel like underprepared, and principals basically agreeing that the new teachers are not prepared. Why do you think that kind of feedback hasn't really taken hold within the university sector when it comes to teacher training?
Well, the honest answer is you'd have to ask them, right? And look, I don't want it to come across that I think that the universities aren't doing anything well, or that the universities shouldn't be preparing teachers, right?
There's variation.
There's huge variation. And, I do think, multiple pathways into teaching is valuable. So, the Teachers Institute we haven't set ourselves up to be deliberately in opposition to the universities.
But it seems like they feel like it's an opposition.
They may, but we're saying, well, here's an alternative model. Here's an alternative pathway, which is attractive to some people. And, one of the things that we've found is that we've got a lot of people coming into our program next year who are career changers. So they're people who have had a career in, a whole range of different areas. So we've got engineers, we've got lawyers, we've got a whole range of different people coming in, and they've decided, actually, now what I'd really like to do is teach. So we're also attracting a different group of people into the profession as well.
I think it's really valuable because sometimes you think about it, and so I'm 30, and I think about what I was like before I was 25, and I think, I was an idiot before I was 25. I graduated medical school at 23, and I'm still like, I was an idiot. I just didn't have the cognitive ability or life experience, and yet I was, in charge of people's, health, decision making in some ways, and you go, well, should I have been doing that? But I think it was all right in the end, right? But then you look back, and you're like, I was not really a proper adult, I think, until I had that sort of breadth of life experience down the line. And then you think about a lot of teachers, primary school teachers, for example. I think they can, if they start uni at 18, they could be in the primary schools teaching by the age of like 21 or 22. Rightly or wrongly, that's up to the individual. But then I wonder about the impact of lack of life experience. And then I think probably some people who are a bit more mature may not be attracted to the idea of going back to a university, but providing that alternative education pathway, like you say, would be attractive to get people who have different life experiences, who would bring that value as well.
And that's one of the things that our participants have told us, is that they likely wouldn't have chosen to come into teaching if they had to go through the university system. They like the fact that we're not a university, that we're different from that. And that's great. And, we do want a range of different people becoming teachers. So if we can offer those different pathways so that people can find the pathway that's going to work best for them, then for me, that's a win.
So you talk about having a different range of teachers, right? Because we want a range of people with a range of life experiences. What we notice as well is that there's declining men who are becoming teachers. Most I think it's 40% of secondary school teachers are men, but it drops off in primary school and then preschool as well. What do you think? Do you think that has any impact on education outcomes for boys? Because I think there's more and more evidence out there in the literature that boys are falling behind in the modern education environment.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So you're right that there's growing evidence to suggest, particularly in particular curriculum areas, that boys are, their results are declining. I don't know whether it has to do with the number of male teachers. Possibly. It'd be really interesting to sort of probe that further. I do know that there is research, I think much of it's come out of the US actually, that's looked at the importance of having teachers from different cultural backgrounds, and particularly for children from minority backgrounds, seeing teachers who are also from those backgrounds is really important in terms of student outcomes, student engagement. So we know that there is evidence around the importance of diversity within our teacher workforce.
And how can we get that, right? Like, 'cause I think one of the big problems, I think, in teaching is that as a society, we've just completely undervalued the role of teachers. The salaries that we give teachers is, far below what I think teachers should deserve, because they have an incredibly important role in molding and shaping the minds of the future, right? Making sure that children learn the basics so that maybe one day they go into higher education or vocational training, and, they're going to essentially be the taxpayers for when, we're probably nearing our retirement, things like that. And these are things that we have to think about. You could think about it in a selfless or a selfish way, but whether or not you're thinking selfish or selflessly, this is going to be an issue if we don't get the education right. What do you think about teachers' salary being based on their competence, or things like that? Because I think the unions are very against that, and but there are some proponents that are saying, oh, well, maybe we should reward teachers who are quote unquote better performing.
Yeah, such an interesting question. So I think there are lots of different things within what you're saying. So as a society, do we need to value our teachers more as a profession? Absolutely we do. The counter to that is we need to make sure that teachers are actually acting as a profession. So I think, those two balance each other out, and we need to address both sides of that. In terms of performance pay, it's such a tricky one. I think one of the things that we do know from in education is that we need to be careful about the unintended consequences that some incentive systems have. And we see that time and time again, and you say, well, a teacher's better. What do we base that on? So there have been examples, particularly in the US, of basing that on just student test scores, on standardized tests. That is not a measure that we want to be using, because then you incentivize teachers just to teach the test, and what we see there is a narrowing of the curriculum and so on and so forth. But do I think we need to think about how we structure teachers' career pathways and how they progress throughout their time as teachers and within the teaching profession? Absolutely. And is part of that going to be looking at pay structures? Yes, it is. But that's not the only part that we need to look at.
So I think it's a very complicated problem, because I was also reading about some survey of recently graduated teachers, and a lot of them themselves hadn't passed NCA so-and-so in maths and English and science and so on. I think these were primary school teachers. That's got to be concerning in terms of, we failed them in the education system before they became teachers, and do they have the foundational skills to then become teachers to educate the next generation? So the question is, well, firstly, we haven't educated them properly, but also, are we attracting a high enough caliber into the education sector as well, if people who would become teachers are instead choosing to become engineers, lawyers, doctors because of the pay differential?
So, I would say the easy answer to that is no, we're not necessarily always attracting our best and brightest into teaching. And I just remember I used to be on faculty at the University of Auckland, and we were in a faculty meeting, this was several years ago, and they showed a graph of the GPAs of incoming students in all the faculties. And the education faculty was at the bottom, but, there was a massive gap between us and the next faculty.
Oh, God.
So, we have the evidence to suggest that we definitely aren't attracting our best and brightest. That doesn't mean that, some of those teachers who are coming in can't become fantastic teachers. They absolutely can. But, you raise a really interesting question about how do we support all of those people coming in to teaching to be the best teachers that they can be, and to ensure that they have the right knowledge and skills to be able to succeed and to support all our children to succeed as well.
So I guess, is it possible to identify the teachers, within a school, teachers already become a teacher, identify the teachers are perhaps performing poorly, and actually give them the extra training so that they can be better? Is that possible?
I think absolutely. I think we need to be doing far more of that. So can we identify teachers who on average are doing better than other teachers? Yes. And, there was a really great study out of the US that looked at different ways of assessing teacher quality. And what it found was that actually students are pretty good judges of whether a teacher is effective or not, and actually just as reliable as using standardized testing data. So yes, we can identify that. I don't think we do it well enough, and we certainly don't provide, this is on average. Of course, there are different schools that are doing it differently, but we don't provide that really targeted support that could take teachers to the next level. And I think we could be doing so much more with that.
And what do you think about how we are preparing teachers with modern day parents? Because I feel that parents today are quite different from my parents' generation. Mm-hmm. My parents met with the teachers once or twice during the teacher parent interviews or whatever it was called, and I don't believe my parents had their email addresses or anything like that. And I guess this generation of parents have a very different level of expectations on teachers than perhaps generations before. But that's at one end of the spectrum. And then also, I guess the other problem is, like we say, chronic absenteeism and parents who are disengaged from education. How do we manage that, the relationship with teachers and parents?
Yeah, such a
Is
good
that
question.
being taught in universities?
So it's actually something that's TTI is definitely going to teach. So yeah, within the Teachers Institute, that's actually something we've talked quite a bit about, and how we can support our trainees to understand how to work effectively with whānau, with parents, and what that entails and what that involves. I don't think that it's been systematically taught across all programs, or being taught as well as it could be. I think one of the values of the Teachers Institute is that because our trainees are part of the full life of the school, they will actually get that exposure to parents. So they won't be active participants in parent-teacher interviews, but they'll be able to sit there with their mentor teacher and listen to how that's conducted and so on and so forth. So that is definitely something that we're going to be doing, but I think it's something that we could do a lot more on. But it's also about schools and how schools set up the expectations of what that relationship's going to be like on both sides, right? So what is it that we're expecting our teachers to be doing, but also how are we expecting our parents and our whānau to be engaging with schools as well?
Because I feel like teachers are tearing their hair out trying to manage the classroom and all the curriculum stuff, trying to make up their own curriculum while their children are failing their literacy and numeracy scores. And on the other hand, there are parents who are tearing their own hair out as well, being like, why can't my child read? And, why is my child not top of the class? All of these different things going on. You're both a parent and an educator. So what is like the one piece of advice that you can give to parents to try and improve their child's education outcomes?
So I guess one thing is that the research really clearly tells us that about 30 to 40% of what contributes to a student's academic outcomes relates to the school. 60 to 70% relates to out-of-school factors. So that is, a big part of it is the family environment, how families are supporting their child at home, and it also connects into socioeconomic status and all these sorts of things. So there are lots of things that parents should be doing to support how how their child is engaging in schools, right? So, reading to your child when they're little every single night and making books and literacy a really strong part of your household, talking and engaging with your child, supporting the socio-emotional development of your child and how they're developing in that respect. So I think there are a whole range of different things that can happen outside of school that are going to support how your child does within school.
And what is the one piece of advice you would give to teachers, especially ones who are new or inexperienced, coming into education or maybe coming to join the Teachers Institute?
So I think one thing to always remember is that, if you listen to the media, we hear so many negative stories coming out about education and about how terrible everything is. And, there are a lot of reasons to be concerned, but also teaching is the most amazing profession. And being able to interact and engage with children and young people every day is so rewarding. Seeing them develop and grow, it's brilliant and it's fun. And so I would really hope that, alongside all the challenges that are involved, we also share just how brilliant it can be as well.
It's very inspiring. I have thought in the past, when I was a kid, I remember people asking me what I wanted to do. And I did say I wanted to be a teacher at one point. But, I also said I wanted to be a lawyer. I also said I wanted to be a dietitian. I don't know how I ended up in this situation where I became a doctor, but here I am. And don't want to go back to uni. Maybe I'll join the TTI one day. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. That's a really bright and hopeful end to the podcast. But I'll end with just one final question. So where would you, if you could choose anywhere to be on holiday, where around the world, past or present even, where would you want to be?
Wow, that is a really big question.
Past or present?
Yeah, I know too much. That's way too much. But honestly, the first thing that sprung to mind was, one of my really special places is we have an old family lake house just outside of Rotorua. And, when I talk about family, it is shared amongst all 13 of my cousins on one side of the family. And it is just such a special place because it holds so many childhood memories. And now my own boys are getting to enjoy it. And it is just a place where we can go, relax, be peaceful, and just enjoy being.
I'm a big fan of Rotorua. You know, there's the lake, there's the mountain biking, the hot pools. I've had many, many memories as a kid going camping there. Pretty much, I feel like every year of like my childhood, we probably went to Rotorua at least once. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Revolving Door Syndrome acknowledges Māori as tangata whenua and Te Tiriti o Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We recognise the inequities and challenges faced by Indigenous and vulnerable groups and acknowledge our duty to work towards closing the gap.